It's another Manly Monday, and this Manly Monday, we're talking about increasingly visible masculinity. Now, what does this mean? Well, the title is borrowed from a paper from 1993, which was called Invisible Masculinity, published in the Proper Study of Men. I don't even know if this journal is still around anymore, but it talks about the fact back in the 90s that, masculinity, since it was considered, the default in public, there was less active thinking about what it meant. Women had to code switch more between home and work. And obviously a lot's changed since the 90s. So that's what I want to talk about today, is now that masculinity has become more visible, now that it's somewhat less centered by society, what does that mean? What does that mean for men that now have to do more conscious mental calculation navigating this gender stuff, right? Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/Leanna K. And this was partially inspired by, I watched the Twisted Sister video for We're Not Gonna Take It. The 80s song, We're Not Gonna Take It. And it got hair battle, man. So guys in makeup encouraging children to turn into the band members. And I'm sitting here thinking, and I know what's his name, D. Snyder, is not super cool with expansive gender stuff. But I thought if this video came out today, the, gender criticals would have a field day with this. And it just sort of shows how the way we talk about things has changed. I mean, I grew up in the 1980s and hair metal it was not considered, it was kind of mainstream. It was that still acceptable, edgy content. And now in many ways is, I won't say more restrictive, but everything is so divided. So many people miss what Sabrina Carpenter is doing with her music videos. Every single one of them's a throwback to some sort of clean but sort of exploitative sexualized content. So the old beach movies, or the girl in the cutoff jean shorts hitchhiking. She's using these media tropes and combining them with songs with very, very modern content. And I think she's doing some really interesting stuff. And all I see is people worrying that it's not okay for kids. And, does a lot of that content go over kids' heads? Sure. But would, if I had to choose between my kids watching, the pretty violent stuff that still gets in under a PG-13 rating, or a Sabrina Carpenter video, I'd rather kids be exposed to Sabrina Carpenter's butt than the violence. And this has been seen as a war on men, or a war on men's desires. And not entirely, because it's also the idea that you're harming kids. That has nothing to do with men and everything to do with, demon woman seducing, don't get pregnant, kids, and because we don't want you to have a secret abortion because we're conservatives and, forwardly pro-life. I wish I was joking about the number of so-called pro-life people who have secret abortions, but hey, it happens. But there is an element of media, especially in games, where the depictions of sexy women have obviously declined. And the given reason is it's more respectful. And I think this is bullshit, but that doesn't change the fact that it's reasonable for a guy seeing this decline to start thinking a lot harder about what the world thinks about male wants, male desires, all that stuff, right? And unfortunately, this discussion ends up being a bickering back and forth about whether or not that actually is what's going on, instead of understanding the perspective that, the stuff a individual person likes is seen as wrong or bad or aberrant or dangerous or something like that, right? It's a waste of time for the purpose of videos like this to talk about whether or not that's what's really happening. What matters is that this is an understandable perception, and this creates more cognitive load. And what I don't get is why kind of feminist circles want to resist this, because this is what, feminist circles have been saying about the realities for women. And we had a discussion about this on the Discord last week about how personally, when, I was doing a lot of cosplay, I got more harassment and groping in more modest costumes than like the Ivy Valentine cosplay or, Power Girl or anything like that. If there were a lot of cleavage, dominatrix style stuff, guys were more respectful than, the worst one, to the point that I actually stopped wearing it, even though it was comfortable, was Brandy from Liberty Meadows. It was a white t-shirt that said Beltsville, jean shorts, and Ked sneakers. Ungodly amounts of unwanted groping, inappropriate comments. One guy fucking force kissed me when I right on every time I think of it, I can still smell and taste like the stale booze on his breath from the night before. Right at San Diego Comic-Con, right in front of security. Security did fuck all. And, these are the things that women think about every time we leave the house, we do a piece of content, we are expected to understand how people are going to react to the way we dress, and we are somehow responsible for the assumptions people make about our intentions, which are usually wrong. I mean, there was somebody brought up a teen girl in like a prom dress that she posted and got like ridiculous comments, and then people said, well, you shouldn't have posted it. You shouldn't have posted something that, you're dressed to get attention, and it wasn't that provocative a dress. And now men are getting the same treatment in terms of assumptions of intents, and it always being seen as bad. And instead of going, yeah, okay, now we can get some empathy. Now we can kind of understand each other a little better. Instead of just, well, women still have it worse. Well, that's not effective, right? Because no matter who has it worse, if we want things to improve, we need to bridge that empathy gap. And I do think that one of the problems with modern masculinity is for all the talk about encouraging men to open up, encouraging men to talk about their feelings, especially vulnerable feelings. When a guy does express distress, the message he gets is suck it up, stop whining. And the challenge is sometimes it is whining. And then the question is, now what? Especially when a guy just has not had a big emotional education. And because a lot of these things are learned skills, right? Woo, sun. really blowing up my shot. How to regulate your emotions is a learned skill. And not only do a lot of men not learn boyhood and young adulthood, just seems absolutely tailor-made to discourage men from regulating and processing emotions. It's pack it down, repress, explode, suffer negative consequences. So suck it up more, repress, explode, suffer negative consequences. That's what is socially enforced despite all the nice talk. In order for us to reduce a lot of the, admittedly wrong behavior, the problems with men taking out their job stress on their spouse, their kids, the family pet, that's not okay. Sharing your feelings is not the same as taking it out on someone. And yes, women do it too. The challenges for both men and women for different reasons is that the behavior that people insist they would prefer, women being straightforward, men being more open with their feelings, is actively socially punished by society. And nobody believes that about the other side because they don't see it. They're not on the receiving end of it, right? They see the internal experience of a woman is straightforward. Oh, thank God. A man expresses feelings. Isn't that nice? Like, how dreamy. They don't experience being that woman or being that man. And like women, if you're direct, bitch, wow, you're so mean. Why are you so cruel? Directness is seen as meanness or bitchiness. A lot of the time, I'm not saying you watching does this, but this is a socially acceptable retaliation people do to shut that down. Similarly, with men, emotional expression does tend to get the mockery. I mock performative fake emotional stuff on this channel too, but that's not about men. That's about people who are, it's insincere, it's theatrical. Sincere expressions of emotion will always, like, if somebody goes, I feel hurt or I feel scared, of course I'm going to stop and listen. Somebody saying, you're doing it on purpose? Nope. Nuh-uh, because I know it's not true. And that's the real challenge, is you can't accept bad behavior, but there's got to be some way to go, that wasn't okay. And, this is what I do. That wasn't okay. I need you to stop doing that. I'm happy to talk about this. If you're feeling scared, if you're feeling angry, whatever, that is cool. Just stop accusing me of things I didn't do. And it is amazing how many people, it's like a dog with a bone. They will not make the correction. And you're not helping a person by giving into that. That's enabling. The problem for a lot of people right now is that they've been enabled for so long. They've been given this sort of path of least resistance that has, supported them into unhappiness. Like the number of things I've seen of guys sharing conversations they had with their mothers, and my jaw drops. And somebody sent me a thing the other day, all up in arms about how they were being depicted on the internet. And they said, I don't treat my mom that way anymore. But you did treat her like that at some point, dude. Own that. If you've gotten better, great. But acknowledge that what's circulating on the internet is shitty behavior. And this idea that everything should be an active reward is one of these challenging things where you understand the idea of getting credit for effort. A bunch of women might be, different upbringings. But, some guys would be, I don't get credit for anything. And I do think that redefining credit, because one of the things I find is I'll test it, and men are so unused to anything being positive. Because, boyhood, adolescence, young adulthood is such a bludgeoning that they will miss or dismiss something that's complimentary. And it's amazing to me how I'll say, you did a good job on that. And then, they'll say, I never get praise or I never get complimented for things. It's like, I said you did a good job 20 minutes ago. Well, that's about something I did, not something that I am. And that's interesting because women, I know me, I'd rather be told, hey, you did a good job on this thing, instead of, oh, you're so inherently this or you're so inherently that, because that's a trap. I mean, you're such a nice person. You're so friendly. You're so considerate turns into bitch, deliberately cruel. You mean, oh my God, you're so like that. It's just this innate trait that people can unplug from you, and it makes no sense. But, that doesn't mean that being validated as a person isn't something that's totally understandable for men to want. And yes, I agree. I think there's less focus on boys' looks. And I mean, if you look at the compliments that people receive, the majority of additional compliments that women receive are for appearance-driven things, which isn't healthy. But when you think girls get, oh, you're such a pretty little girl, boys don't get, you're such a handsome little boy. It's you're brave, you're strong, you're tough, you're smart. And smart is, I wish people would stop calling their kids smart, because it becomes this trap. It becomes this, it's like Sisyphus's rock, right? They keep having, every time they feel confused or lost or like they don't have the answer, or heaven forbid they made a mistake, it is identity destroying, because smart doesn't mean infallible. But the minute, and this is science, like if you praise kids for innate characteristics, they become less resilient than if you praise kids for effort. We need to start saying, you worked really hard on this. I appreciate your effort. And like, look, the results show that the effort was worth it. Focusing on results is something that's going to have to be done. But as everyone who's trying to do an event right now, the Jays are in the World Series, like 2 different events so far that I've been involved with have been affected by the fact that there are playoff games going on, and so nobody shows up or attendance is depressed. There's no way to know that when you plan events. You cannot avoid sports. You just don't know. And that's the thing. There's certain things you can control. There's certain things you can't. And because masculinity is so results driven, and over the last few years, the gender binary, we've become obsessed with the gender binary, or lack thereof, depending on where you come down on that. But the focus on gender being this innate quality in the brain, I think is, as much as I believe absolutely that's true, I've seen evidence of that. The question is what to do with the people that are atypical that way, like myself, so that it's not coercive. one way or the other. And I do think that as the fixation on gender and whether it's real and whether it's a body thing, and so our behavior has to conform to our body, or it is something that's, in the mind, that people have the right to change their bodies to match that, we've really, the boxes have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. I see it in the fixation in my appearance with stuff where it's just not fucking relevant, or my fertility where it's not fucking relevant. I'm talking about fucking video games, and it comes up like, if being model attractive were a requirement to talk about games, most of, the really popular streamers wouldn't have careers, and they're all men. So that is a problem. Similarly, though, masculinity has gotten quite restrictive, and that's why it's become visible. Instead of it being kind of this flexible, general path, there's always been norms, but they used to not be as rigid. You used to have the business guy on TV, the lawyer show guy, the doctor show guy, but then you'd have like the regular blue collar guy who was centered in sitcoms. And that kind of blue collar guy, you see less and less in that now in media, especially aimed at men. The characters are all more like what female characters were. There have to be something innately exceptional about them. The fairest in the land, the youngest ensign in the fleet. Thank you, Mary C. Fanfiction. Something extraordinary about this woman, and that's why there were stories. There were plenty of stories about ordinary guys, and we're getting fewer and fewer of those. And so that hits men particularly hard, just because men tend to be overrepresented at the very top percentiles of success, financial success, and then at the very bottom, whereas women tend to be more evenly distributed in the middle. And that means that women, are underrepresented in management positions, especially executive positions. But there's fewer women who sort of check out of the system completely. Now, that's a little misleading because, being a stay-at-home mom, as, controversial that maybe in certain feminist circles, is more acceptable than being a stay-at-home dad. And so women, even if you're not working, have a place in society, whereas, men can just kind of fall off the model, so to speak. And I think that being more acutely aware of this is driving an anxiety among those sort of regular guys who have been taught, these really toxic things with no basis in science, like the whole 80-20 thing. There's nothing to that I don't know where that came from. The truth is, in fact, that egalitarian marriages are on the rise. It's more and more common for men and women to contribute about 50% of household incomes, meaning 80% of women are not only interested in 20% of men. People kind of find their level. And instead of going, oh, that gives me hope, I see guys go, I'm not going to trust this. It's reassuring, so it must not be true. And I mean, that's a trauma response. And the problem is, if you go to look for one of the big traumas, you're not going to find it because it's a complex trauma. It's all these little digs, all the neglect, especially in men, the fact that they didn't get that nurturing. And I'm not talking coddling when I say nurturing. I'm saying look, Either you gotta put in the effort, like, do you really think you put in the appropriate effort for this project? Okay, I guarantee you put in more work next time, you're gonna do better. That's hope. Or if you know somebody worked really hard on something and it didn't go their way, acknowledging that they put a lot of work into it, because that happens in life. Sometimes we put a ton of work in and things don't work out. It's still worth putting the work in, because if you don't put the work in, you don't create opportunities. So rewarding the work, rewarding the people taking the shot, that's very important. And that's something that men don't experience the same way that women do, because there aren't the same, really unified programs, I will say, because programs for men and boys are there. I see them. They're all over the place. They're undersubscribed. But because of that distrust, when you say correctly that some of this manosphere stuff that makes men feel like it's hopeless is bunk, you get this reaction in guys of, this feels comforting, therefore it must be grift somehow. The only truth is pain. That's a mindset that has been taught. And that's the fact that that's molded, the fact that that's taught, that's invisible for a lot of guys. They believe that's just the way it is, and it's not. We know that success is not a predictor of happiness, but happy people tend to be more resilient and stick to things better. And so they are, on the whole, more successful. That doesn't mean freaking billionaires. It just means comfortable. And really, that's the only thing you control. That kind of like astronomical success, that's luck. It really is. It's being at the right place in the right time with the right product. But, doing reasonably well, that is within our control. And working hard does not mean working destructively. It doesn't mean working yourself sick. It just means being diligent. But we brutalize young men, in late childhood and all through adolescence, to the point that they become kind of blind and deaf to any encouraging messaging, any hopeful messaging. And they zero in on the scary stuff, on the threats. But that's a recipe for a lack of resilience, a lack of emotional regulation, and self-sabotage. And it's not guys' fault. That's the part we need to make more visible, how that is trained. Because right now, what the visible part of masculinity is how, nobody cares about men. The world doesn't care about men. There's no programs for men. And this is because men being centered in society, job programs are not called men's jobs programs. But the fact that there's women's jobs programs, women's mentoring, that was because those programs were designed because there was a lack of it pre-existing. That's why they're called women's. The men was silent in the job program, the homeless shelter. Women's shelters are homeless shelters for women. Now, more and more in Canada, at least, we are getting men's shelters that advertise as men's shelters that men can take their kids in a, if they're in a violent home. That we have co-ed ones that are called family shelters here as well, but the police have become more aware that these exist, and so they can refer, and so they're becoming more popular. We're getting more data from it, but homeless shelters, original homeless shelters, were designed for Civil War soldiers, which were all men, and I'm not saying homeless shelters are nice places for men or women. But, some are better than others. But the default was men. That was, we talk about job creation. We usually talk about things like construction jobs, male dominated. And it's not male job creation, it's implied. And that's the invisible part. And because that invisible part has lessened, there's this perception that, men are falling behind or men are doing less well. And, the educational statistics, depending on how you read them, in sheer grades, women's grades have come up. That's why they've sort of overshot men. Women's participation in college has gone up. Now, men are going to college less because they don't trust the system. But I don't think that's the right metric. I think it's success long term that is the correct metric. I mean, you go to college to get a degree so you can get the job you want, right? And that's when it becomes very clear that it's not about who does better, men or women. What it is that men either succeed spectacularly or fail spectacularly. Women inhabit the middle. Now, which is better? Depends on the metric you use, right? We need to start making this stuff more visible so it's easier to understand and we can calibrate the messages. Like, obviously, those men who are overrepresented right at the bottom of the success pyramid will probably benefit from having their efforts rewarded so that they are more resilient, so that they try again, right? That's something that is an easy fix. But it is also the cost of retraining, the cost of going back to school, that kind of stuff. And that really conflicts with kind of traditional masculinity norms of that's a handout, right? I don't want charity. We know from a mental health perspective, men are more resistant to seeking help. Men are more resistant in admitting anything's wrong in the first place. And that is an invisible force in society that does not, ask any guy, they don't like that they feel like they have to keep everything inside. They just feel like they have to. And when you start unpacking why, the answers get interesting. But the first step to that is shining a light on it. You don't have to reward bad behavior to listen. You do have to get the person to realize the behavior was not great before you have the conversation. And nobody should expect to be verbally abusive and then get their head petted. A recognition of wrongdoing, like sincere, like I should not have done that. Not, here's why I did it. Yeah, okay, maybe it wasn't great, but here's why I did it. No. That's basically telling the person that you're going to do it again because you got away with it. And that is a very difficult balance, and that can only be done one-on-one. And it is somewhat time-consuming. And we do have to get better at respecting boundaries culturally. And we cannot expect men to understand boundaries if their own aren't respected. So things like bullying, things like toughen up ideologies, things like, I'm going to make you strong, you're weak, right? A child gets told they're weak. This is encouraging a boy or a young man to ignore their own boundaries, to get rid of them, to have them be non-existent. And that's just dehumanizing. Our boundaries are what make us human. Our boundaries are what give us a sense that we're safe. Our boundaries give us the ability to trust. And men and boys, that stuff is ripped away from them in a way that's unique from the way boundaries are ripped away from girls. I mean, we talk about, girls starving themselves to be skinny and going through all these painful beauty procedures. And that is a boundary violation of its own kind. It's different. It's not that one has it better or worse. But again, we need to make the boundary violations in boys and men more visible so that we can talk about them and find alternatives. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/Leanna K. If something in this video speaks to you, you want to sign up for a Leanna Care session yourself, the link is in the description box below. Thanks for watching Manly Mondays.